So I've had this fascination with old cemeteries, and I found out that a lot of people, they drive by these places. They're in the middle of the woods, they're in the middle of a cornfield, and you hardly even notice them. But not so long ago, a lot of these people had lives. You would have known who they were, what they did. They did very important things, but now their graves are lost to the dustbin of history. Who are they? What did they do? And why should we care? So, in our quest to find out who these people are in these different abandoned graves, we've come to Pettyjohn Cemetery for our first mission to uncover who these people are. Now, Deming, Indiana was a place where the Underground Railroad from the 1840s and 50s came right through here. Many of the people buried in this cemetery here were participants in helping fugitive slaves get to freedom in Canada. Now, one of the graves that I discovered while here and had done some background work on belongs to Jesse Baker, a man who was heavily involved in the Underground Railroad. And let's go see if we can't find where his headstone is. So, Jesse Baker has a very interesting story. In 1837, a man named Samuel Burke comes to his front door wet, tired, and hungry. The man was a fugitive slave coming from Missouri and had escaped with his wife and young daughter to find freedom. Jesse Baker takes the man in, convinces him to change his name to John Rhoads in order to mask his identity from slave hunters who were no doubt looking for him at the time. As a matter of fact, this man, now known as John Rhoads, had just completed a daring mission across the Mississippi River with his wife and young child in tow. He'd literally built a raft by hand and floated his desperate family across the raging river mere minutes before the bloodhounds of his former master, a man named Singleton Vaughn, reached the shores of the river. Vaughn watched helplessly as the family landed safely in Illinois, a free state, meaning that he would have to petition a judge for his former slave's return. Now, this Mr. Vaughn had plans for John Rhoads, specifically for his wife and child. He intended to permanently take them from John and sell them into the deep South, never to be seen again. So in the span of a few days, Mr. Vaughn did indeed capture the Rhoads family and had them put in jail to await processing papers. But that little section of Illinois was filled with abolitionists who sprung the Rhoads family free from jail and sent them on their way to where we stand today in Deming, Indiana. Until 1844, when Mr. Vaughn improbably shows up in Deming to reclaim the Rhoads family, but instead finds himself at odds with a pack of heroic abolitionists, hell-bent on saving their friend, led by Joseph Baker and the man whose moss-covered stone now lies here in the mud, Jesse Baker. Because the slave hunters and the slave master, Mr. Vaughn, came to Deming, Indiana, disguised as fur traders, and found where John Rhoads lived. They knocked on John Rhoads' door, told him to come out. John Rhoads, holding an axe at the front door, began calling out for help, while his wife, Luann, started building a fire in the chimney so that the hunters would not be able to come down and capture them. As John Rhoads is calling for help all through the night, fending off the slave master and slave hunters, Jesse Baker, who lived not too far from here, where we're standing, heard the cries, ran to John Rhoads for help. Joseph Baker was the next to arrive upon the scene. He refused to be halted by the besiegers and was admitted into the cabin by John. Soon other neighbors began to arrive, and Mr. Vaughn was questioned as to his intentions. He replied that it was his intention to take his former slaves before the proper officers for identification, after which he intended to take them south. A consultation was held which led to the proposition that if Mr. Vaughn would consent to go to Westfield for trial, the friends of John would advise him to surrender. This was agreed upon, and the entire party, slaves, officers, and master, were taken to the home of Martin Anthony, where they had a very uncomfortable and surely ironic breakfast together. Now, not too far from here is the scene of the great commotion that took place as the slave hunter and slave masters were taking the Rhoads family towards Westfield. The driver of the wagon carrying the Rhoads family sharply veered towards Noblesville. It was at this point that a man named Daniel Jones leapt upon the wagon. He had fire in his eyes, claimed he had a gun, and dared them to shoot. The man who'd been driving the wagon dove off in fear, and Daniel Jones took off at great haste towards Westfield, the agreed upon location to initiate the trial. On the way to Westfield, Jones had driven so fast that the Rhoads family fell out of the wagon and were absconded to the farm of Robert Tomlinson, where they were hid throughout the duration of the trial. On this historical marker here, which stands just 100 feet from where the incident took place, amongst the road where the wagon would have driven, you'll notice that it says the family was initially headed to Noblesville, that Vaughn had agreed to take them there. But in the earliest references to this story, it was clear the agreed upon location for the trial was initially Westfield. And it was the slave hunters and slave masters, including this Mr. Vaughn, that had decided at the last minute to try to take the wagon to Noblesville. There were hundreds of people lining the roads, and nobody was going to have that. So much pandemonium had broken out that after one day of trial in Westfield, they agreed to move the trial to Indianapolis. Meanwhile, the Rhoads family was hiding out with various people involved in the Underground Railroad here in Deming, Indiana. The verdict of the trial dealt a crushing blow to the slave master Vaughn, and since the Rhoads family had fallen out of the wagon on the way to the trial, and they weren't present in court, Mr. Vaughn had little recourse but to sue the abolitionists for the aiding in the loss of his human property, for which they were found not guilty. The judge dealt Vaughn a further blow by agreeing that the Rhoads family was indeed entitled to their freedom on account of their 6 months being worked as slaves in Illinois. So Mr. Vaughn packed his bags and went to the South with an empty wagon and a lighter wallet. But as you pan around through all of the other stones here, you do find many more people who have interesting stories. Behind me is also the grave marker of Jesse Baker's wife, Ann Baker. She was known to take in fugitive slaves as they came through the Underground Railroad, clothed them, fed them, helped get them back on their feet. Normally they were very tired. Generally, Deming, Indiana was one of the first stops they would make after crossing into free territory. Ann Baker took some grief for having these people in her house, but she knew what was right and she did the right thing. And as far as women pioneers in the freedom movement, and as far as abolition goes, Ann Baker is as much of a hero as Jesse Baker is today, who again risked his life for a man he'd only known for a few years, a man who did not look like him, but somebody who deserved the same respect that he would hope for and that you and I would hope for today. Now, the Underground Railroad ran right through Deming, Indiana, like we had mentioned previously, and the trek was arduous. It was done either on foot or horseback, and imagine in those days, all around us was a thick forest and nearly impassable swamps. Indiana today is a lot of farmland because the trees in the forest have been cleared. You could never picture it, but it was said by the great pioneer William Connor that you could walk several days in Indiana and never exit the canopy of trees that you'd be under. It was indeed a thick woodland forest, and these desperate fugitive slaves would come through this area on foot or on horseback, tired and exhausted, and to be greeted by somebody like Ann Baker must have been a relief for them. One thing to note about these stones, both Jesse and Ann Baker have the date of 1901 listed on the base of the stone. Now, we know Jesse Baker died in 1891, so why would he have a stone listing the date of 1901? Well, we've concluded that these two stones for Jesse and Ann Baker were added at a later date. It's possible that after they died and were buried here, either a crude type of stone was placed there or a field stone may have been used to mark the location, and at a later time, these more impressive stones were added what would be 10 years later. Jesse Baker, the first man to respond to the desperate calls of John Rhoads. Who was John Rhoads? Why should we care? He was a fugitive slave who cheated death and imprisonment, only to find himself in Deming, Indiana with his wife and young daughter. When his master came looking for him, he sorely underestimated the spirit of freedom that resided in this area, for his runaway slave was now a respected member of the community, and better still, a friend of all. Jesse Baker rallied the people to confront the slave master and ultimately raised funds to permanently settle the matter in court. The verdict altered the course of history in this area, as Rhoads was declared legally free. Imagine if the man whose tomb lies right here, toppled and forlorn, had not heard John Rhoads' desperate cries that night. Or worse yet, imagine if he had simply ignored them completely. He was certainly under no obligation to risk his life to save this man, this John Rhoads. But this was not just anybody, and he was certainly no one's property. John Rhoads was a friend of Jesse Baker and of all those who lived in Deming. Baker's actions that day saved the entire bloodline of John Rhoads, and it's a shame to see the man's grave disregarded and forgotten.